Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News. I'm Laura Spencer, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm filling in for my colleague Amelia this week while she's on annual leave. So I'll just pass over to Peter Wright to introduce himself, and then we'll get started with our first stories.
Thank you, Laura. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and managing director at Digital Law, and got some interesting stuff to cover this week after the long bank holiday. And it's also great to welcome Laura back onto the podcast for your comeback, as it were, after a few months. So welcome back.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, starting with our first story today then. So this is one from the ICO. So as many of you may know, last year there was a leak of CCTV footage from the Health Secretary of State, Health and Social Care, Matthew Hancock, and his former aide. So these were videos of them breaching COVID guidelines at the time. And the ICO actually then investigated this. Not only did they investigate this for a data breach, but they also did a criminal investigation to try and find who was at fault. So they looked into this for many months and basically found that the CCTV footage was taken by a video on using a mobile phone. During the investigations, a total of 6 phones were retrieved and actually searched under warrant. However, none of the phones actually contained the CCTV footage that they were after. So after seeking legal advice about this, they actually concluded that there was insufficient evidence to actually charge anyone with criminal offences under the Data Protection Act 2018, and therefore this investigation is now closed.
Indeed, this is an interesting story, but indeed dating back to the heady days of the height of the pandemic, when the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was found to be breaking the social distance regulations. So there was no 2 meters here, it was more like 2 centimeters between him, or 2 millimeters even, between him and his aide, Gina, who is now his partner, after he ended up leaving his wife as a result of this scandal. Now, at the time, you know, this footage and the stills of this footage found its way into the Great British Press, ended up publishing it in fairly graphic detail and putting some silly headlines by it, which pretty rapidly made his position untenable. But it was quite clear, as you quite rightly say there, Laura, that we were looking at CCTV, but it's not the raw footage. It's the fact that someone has clearly had access to this CCTV and thought, this is very sensitive in more ways than one. Let's go and breach this to cause maximum harm and embarrassment to the Secretary of State for Health and the government. So hence the ICO has carried out an investigation, and it looks like someone's recorded the CCTV using their phone, and they've taken the video, hence why it's not brilliant quality that in terms of the footage that was leaked. And then the ICO's looked at this, they've seized phones, they've got quite broad powers, let's not forget here, so they can issue warrants for this stuff, which they have used in the past. So there is that footage of the ICO tearing into Cambridge Analytica's offices back in 2016, when they were looking at allegations around the manipulation of elections. So this is something that you know, they can take quite significant sweeping actions. However, in this instance, they've not been able to actually find evidence of the recording. So either whoever recorded it has not just deleted it, they will have deleted evidence that the recording ever existed. But I suspect that whoever did this would have known they would need to cover their tracks, and so it could still be one of the 6 people whose devices were taken. It's just that they've been able to more cleverly, skillfully hide their tracks, or indeed, you know, somehow magically acquire new mobile devices and make sure they couldn't be incriminated in this instance. So it looks like there's going to be no criminal offence, but it's interesting that the ICO took this so seriously. Would they have taken it so seriously were it not a Secretary of State? I
Probably
think,
not.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, you know, I just found it interesting, just in general, because day to day we see the ICO investigating things from a data breach standpoint and kind of being the company themselves reporting the breach and then going on, and it's like a direct breach between the company and then the people finding this information. Whereas this kind of is like the middleman involved, and you don't necessarily see the ICO going down the criminal investigation route very often, not out and publicly talking about it anyway. I know there has been prosecutions in the past under the Data Protection Act, but yeah, they're not very common compared to the other breaches that we see.
Exactly. I mean, in fact, you and I were talking the other day about the classic case of the gym instructor who left his local authority job at a sort of council gym, but decided to email all of he basically took the contact list of all the people that used the gym, emailed them saying, oh, I'm setting up as a personal trainer on my own. Why don't you get in touch with me for some sessions? So he ended up imprisoned for that, using these very self-same powers, albeit pre-GDPR, but an example of the same fairly heavy levels of enforcement that can be carried out. But an interesting contrast here when you think of the fairly anemic attempts at enforcing GDPR we've had since 2018, not just in the UK. I mean, arguably the ICO has tried. You know, they have rolled out the big fines of BA and Marriott and various others, Tuckers, etc. But the overall volume of enforcement, not just the UK, but all the European data protection regulators, has been pretty poor, which is disappointing definitely. When you think of all the work that everyone took to try and make sure they were going to comply with this. The actual practices that seem to be taking place that aren't being investigated is ridiculous. But in this instance, oh, what a surprise! You know, the full force of the ICO is employed to try and find whoever did it, and they've not found anyone. But I'm sure that you can imagine the government would have been keen to find out exactly how and why this happened, just to make sure it doesn't happen again, to put it bluntly. But I suppose to make sure it doesn't happen again, well, you shouldn't really be having an affair in the office where you work every day during a pandemic. Yes. But
absolutely. So moving on to our next story then. So this is a cyber attack actually on Funky Pigeon. So Funky Pigeon is obviously the online greetings card retailer, which is owned by WH Smith. And they've had to recently stop taking new orders through their website because they've been victim of a ransomware attack. So they became aware of this incident last Thursday. So should have now reported this to the ICO under the 72-hour window from the date of knowledge. And they have confirmed that the no customer data, payment data has been put at risk. However, other customer data such as their names, email addresses and postal addresses have been compromised. So some data has been affected. We don't know the full extent, but we know it's not financial, but we haven't heard anything as to whether they've gone to the ICO about this yet.
Indeed. I think an interesting story this showing that organisations large and small continue to be vulnerable to ransomware. Yeah. I mean, Funky Pigeon is now a significant player. It's funny, we've had a spate this week of companies declaring their sort of results, and some of which have been a little bit down compared to where they were at the height of the pandemic. So, you know, online streaming companies, takeaway delivery companies that all had an absolutely fantastic 2020 when everyone was stuck at home and couldn't really have any option to do anything else. You know, some of these companies did very well. So you can imagine that for Funky Pigeon, they did quite well for WH Smith at a time when all of their outlets in airports and railway stations had a fairly poor year. But then it's not great in this instance. They're turning around saying, yeah, we've been hacked. And probably at a time when, you know, their sales will be commensurately smaller than they otherwise would have been, because, you know, things have been open. People are wanting to actually, it turns out, return to some of the habits they had before. It's actually quite nice to stand in a shop and pick out cards rather than necessarily order them online. So not great when you think, yeah, they're going to be struggling to establish or maintain growth in a post-pandemic world, to then be finding that they've got these problems. You know, ransomware can be, we'll always sort of find any system that has a potential vulnerability on it that hasn't been patched, that hasn't been updated, and can cause it's not just a matter of paying the ransom. It's then the fact that you get stories like this, and this story is from the Times newspapers. Their business section has reported this following tweets that were made from their own official, from Funky Pigeon's own official Twitter account on Friday. So it's all gone wrong quite rapidly there. It's interesting that, you know, this has come out at a time when, as the story says, WH Smith is due to report its half-yearly results But they say, oh, this shouldn't have a material impact on the financial position. Well, it will, because its shares in WH Smith fell 53 pence, or 3.5%, on news of the report. So this is where there's always that added, it's not just paying the ransom, it's what it does to a market capitalization, it's what it does to reputation. Will this potentially put consumers off providing their personal data to Funky Pigeon to get a nice personalized card? Well, yeah, it probably will. So it's not come at an ideal time for them at all. Interesting as well that CrowdStrike Intelligence here, there's just sort of the and finally at the end, they've then said in 2020 they identified 142 data extortion cyber attacks. That suggests that's major ones that particular agency has found, but there's probably been an awful lot more. It's actually, I think, a questionable way of reporting it, if anything, the way that the Times have done it there. That obviously makes you think, oh, there are 142 instances of this in 2020. No. There will have been tens of thousands of these things in 2020 that we know of, and then far many more millions where people are too embarrassed to report it and didn't do it, or simply forced them under. So, yeah, there's it illustrates, yes, organisations large and small. I think we talked recently as well about The Works, the publishing outlet, also being hit, and that's referenced in here as well, where they had to have major problems then, not just with the cyber attack, but with then supplying their stores as well. So there can always be knock-on losses and effects from a ransomware attack. It's not the headline paying the ransom. It's the sort of gradual throttling of a business that can then occur over the subsequent weeks and months. In this instance, yes, what's the headline? Funky Pigeon halts new orders. So suddenly if people are thinking, oh, I'd go on and make an order, oh, I can't do it. No, I'll go somewhere else then. So once those people have gone,
exactly.
Come back.
No, definitely not. And just sticking on that page of cybersecurity then, so the NCSC have recently come out and confirmed that they're joining international partners to issue advice on latest Russian cyber threats. So basically this is all about the fact that due to everything that's going on at the minute with the Russians' invasion into Ukraine and ongoing events, the NCSC have announced that we are subject to heightened threats at the minute, and they've actually come out with some guidance that basically details some actions that companies and organisations should be taking because of the cyber threat being heightened. So this whole guidance is on the NCS website, and it covers 4 key points. So it talks about balancing risk, factors affecting an organisation's cybersecurity risk, actions to take, which include checking system patching, verifying access controls, reviewing backups, having an incident response plan in place should this happen, knowing how to respond to the more common attacks such as phishing attacks, and then briefing your wider organisation and team about such actions you're taking, and then finally covering points about advanced actions, so points that people should be taking if they're very in a sector that may be hit by a cyber attack and it have more of an effect.
Indeed, I think it's very timely guidance there that's come out from the NCSC. Don't forget, of course, that we had things like the NotPetya ransomware attack in 2017 that originated from the Russian-occupied eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass. So there's been problems throughout this ongoing conflict, which has been underway, of course, since 2014 in Ukraine, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. It's only the full-scale invasion that happened in February of this year. So there's been heightened risk of sort of fallout from Russia using increasingly aggressive forms of ransomware and cyber warfare against Ukraine. And of course, there are no boundaries and borders online, so the potential for this contagion to then spread through the rest of the internet remains very, very high. And this is all good advice that the NCSC has issued here. And I can imagine some people might read it and go, well, sure, this is all self-evident that you need to make sure that patches are updated and verifying access controls. Well, clearly it isn't, otherwise they wouldn't be making the point, is the rather frustrating answer to that. And, you know, I'm sure they must feel sometimes they're sounding a bit like a broken record with this, but the point remains, and that this sort of goes back to the fact that, for example, Tucker's LLP was fined just last month for failing to put patches on in contravention of their own internal policies. They had a patch that should have gone onto the system. They didn't do it. That was then hacked. That became a problem. So they're basically sort of saying, you know, make sure you are being proactive in this current heightened level of risk from ransomware attacks. You know, they're saying make sure that your backups work. So if you are then trying to rely on your business continuity protocols, you want to make sure that they work in extremis. Don't just sort of almost find yourself using that in case of emergency break glass panel and then find there's nothing behind it. Is the key point there. But it's just like kind of making the point that, you know, this heightened level of awareness is something we need to be mindful of. We need to be thinking about this now in response to that invasion. And we also, I think, due to the fairly volatile global political situation at the moment, when there are major incidents like this around the world, major flashpoints, these are the sorts of actions we need to take. We need to then look at those risk indicators and think, well, God, it's actually even worse now. What do we do? One of the key points there that make as well is knowing how to respond to a phishing attack, or indeed spot one. And Laura, you and I were actually talking earlier on about one email that we'd received that appeared to come from a well-known information security publisher online, saying, click here to find out about our latest phishing report. Download the updated report now. And you thought, is there some irony in there? So sure enough, I actually went along to their main website to see, well, is this report genuine? And sure enough, there was no sign on the website of anything to do with that report. So either that is about actual malware and someone is going around and, you know, trying to put this stuff on and impersonating a well-known cybersecurity publisher's brand and sort of ident, say, oh, look, you think this is a perfectly trustable and verifiable thing when it isn't. Or they're actually, who knows, you might click on download and go, yes, you failed the first test of spotting an item of phishing. Whichever it is, it's not really great. But it really highlights the fact that it's getting to the point now that whenever, as a firm, we receive any email, even from trusted clients and suppliers, we're now incredibly wary about downloading anything attached to it and clicking on any links that it may contain. And that's really the position that I think that everyone should be following right now. And it might frustrate, you know, clients, colleagues, etc. if you go back and say, can you just confirm if this attachment is genuine? Is this email actually from you? Did you send this link? Yeah, can we exchange this information in a slightly more secure way than how you've attempted to do it here? And it might drive people around the bend, but to be honest, I'd say it's a better thing to do that at the moment than fall risk to phishing, ransomware, and the wider threats here, which the NCSC is trying to highlight.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to mention as well that I think a lot of companies, like smaller companies, for example, probably think, well, why would I be targeted? And I think a lot of people, because you typically see in the news, you don't see the smaller companies, you don't see the smaller like firms getting hacked or anything like that. But it is completely random. A lot of, they're just targeting any vulnerabilities they can see. And it's not like they're picking a specific company. It might be the case sometimes, but most of the time it's not. They're just picking any company that shows vulnerability and going for that one. And you could always be that unlucky.
Exactly.
Yeah. So moving on to our final story then. So this is still about Russia, but this is about some stolen AirPods, which actually gave away the position of Russian troops. So a Ukrainian man basically lost his AirPods, and they were looted from his home near Kiev, so about 18 miles away from Kiev, a couple of weeks ago. And they were stolen by a Russian troop, and then he used that to go on his Find My feature, which is available for Apple products, and basically follow the progress of the stolen AirPods via Bluetooth. So they were obviously taken from a town around 70 miles away from Kiev. They then crossed the border into Belarus, and eventually ended up in a city called Gomel, And last week they actually reached a city in Russia where President Putin is amassing his troops for an assault on Donbass. So I think it just basically illustrates the power that this technology has. And yeah, the fact of how scary it is that you could lose an AirPod from a house, and then that can then go on to show where you are, your activities, what you're doing. And I think the important thing is similar to I think a story that Peter mentioned a couple of weeks ago in an episode about somebody who was found out on LinkedIn, and they actually then kidnapped his family and tried to get information about him because he worked at a bank. Similar things could happen. People might break into your house, steal something like this, and then they know all the information because they've seen where you go. And then it could end up leading to something obviously bigger and a bit more dangerous.
Indeed, there's quite a few takeaways from this, aren't there, Laura? I mean, it's absolutely that. I mean, particularly if someone nicks your phone but not your AirPods, they'll then be able to think, oh well, yes, we can trace what you're doing, because they'll be able to find your AirPods on you and then access your phone. So a reminder to make sure that your phone is, of course, protected. This should be by default now, but don't switch the thing off. You always want it where either a fingerprint or a code is required to get into the device. That's number one.
Yeah.
Number two is that, unfortunately, AirPods, and not just in the, specific thing AirPods there, but arguably there are other Bluetooth items out there that you could be connected to that could allow for this level of detection. And in this instance, there's no limit on what could happen. I mean, clearly this has been over a period of days where, the AirPods are being charged up, so they're still being used, and the phone is showing to fairly accurate, probably down to the 3 feet of the usual GPS location data.
Yeah.
Exactly where these AirPods are. Now, we talked about a story a couple of months back about Apple AirTags, which are the devices you can specifically buy. So you could put an AirTag, for example, onto your car keys or onto another item that you frequently lose. So the idea would be, where are my car keys? Check on the phone. They're over there where I left them. Now, that's kind of the idea behind, you think, oh, that would be really useful technology. There's numerous things you can use it for. But of course, then people found that, oh, surprise, surprise, people are using it for really rather nasty, creepy purposes. So, women will suddenly find them on their cars. Oh, one of them just happened to work their way under a car seat. I wonder how it got there. It was stuffed behind a car bumper. And sure enough, it's being used for surveillance by, that's not something about some of the horrors that could ensue from that. So Apple then said, okay, but the AirTags will make it so that they will only function for a set period of time. Before then, after they're away from the device, they'll stop working after a period of time, and that they would start to make a noise, i.e. that an individual would know that the AirTag was there because you'd hear it.
Yes.
So that, in theory, makes it less potential to be used for creepy purposes. But surprise, surprise, look at the AirPods here, which are tiny little things. All it takes is for someone to then put that into a pocket on clothing or whatever, and suddenly you can follow someone.
Mm-hmm.
And potentially even bug them and listen to what's going on. That's not scary at all, is it? And the point here is that, unfortunately, this technology is showing that it could still be used and subverted for various nefarious purposes. So in this instance, it's an example, unfortunately, of how the Russian army is giving away blatant intelligence fairly easily through its and it's being compromised through almost through the gullibility and the avarice of their own soldiers. But also it's highlighting, I think, a fairly major risk around the use of this technology, which on the face of it, you think, oh, great, it's great, really useful, really helpful. But always there's that risk that it can be used for something rather darker as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key point here. Initially, when I looked at this story, I did think of just the meaning behind it. But then I think when you read a bit deeper and you actually think about the effects it could have, yes, it is scary.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, that's everything that we have time for today. So that was our last story for today. Just a reminder that this podcast is available on all the channels. So it goes up on our YouTube channel, on our website, and then goes on Google, Spotify, Apple, all the podcast channels as well. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping us produce this webinar. And we did want to mention as well that Anson Evaluate are actually going to be hosting some new premium CPD webinar sessions over the next couple of weeks and months, starting on, I believe it is the 5th of May. And sticking with the theme of today's news episode, the first round of these sessions is actually going to be focused around cybersecurity, with the first session actually being on ransomware. So I'll just pass over to Peter just to talk a little bit more about that. But all the registration links are up on our website and on social media channels as well, and you can register now for those.
Indeed, thank you very much, Laura. And yes, so we're doing a course of 12 individual webinars. So the first 4 are on cybersecurity, the second 4 are on data protection, the third, fourth are and then the third block of 4 is on digital economy, so things like social media law, cryptocurrency, NFTs, blockchain, etc. So the first 4 are on cyber, and the first one of those 4 is on ransomware. And we'll be going through in quite a lot of detail in terms of a lot of the sorts of issues that we cover on this podcast. Covering everything from issues around the heightened risk around ransomware at the moment, the double extortion, some of the risks. What do you do to try and protect yourself from this? What can be some of the consequences? What do you need to do in terms of demonstrating best practice, as well as, you might want to sort of display legal and regulatory compliance, but what does best practice look like as well? I'll be looking at all of these things in a fair amount of detail. You can either purchase a one-off ticket to one webinar for £45, or there is also a special offer running for being able to buy all 12 at a discount. And that is available, of course, for all of the listeners of this podcast. So if you're interested in that, please do go along to the website. All details are also on the Digital Law Facebook page, on Digital Law's LinkedIn page, and on Twitter at Digital Law UK. It's also on Anson Evaluate. If you go on LinkedIn, if you go on Facebook, all the information's there. And that should mean that you are then able to go. You can go online, register there, and access the content that we are putting together. And if you do like all of that, of course, also you can give us a quick like and a reshare through your social media channels as well. So yes, we look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible for that course and for that first webinar. It'd be great to see you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you again for everyone for listening today. All that information is on our website and on social media as well. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.